Okay, just want to check that everyone can hear me because I put some earphones in because my flatmate is cooking. So can everyone hear me okay? If you could let me know on Twitter or in the chat, that would be wonderful before I start. Okay, right, I've been told that you can't hear the blending, but you can hear me, so that might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. Depends on your view. Right, okay, so thank you again to whoever is out there. Really not a fan of doing these where you don't get any sort of visual, verbal feedback, either from seeing people there or at least a message chat kind of function being used. So again, we'll see how it goes. If you came to the reading, I can only apologise that you decided to spend another hour this time with me talking about curriculum, but thank you anyway. If you didn't come to my reading, I can only be offended that you've chosen not to spend that extra time with me, but thank you to coming to this one anyway. So this one we want to talk about curriculum, particularly curriculum coherence. I'll briefly talk about why I think now is the coming of curriculum coherence, and then look at how I think best to do it, a few examples, and then some recommended resources at the back as well. If you have any questions, you can message me on Twitter at mralmond_ed, or you can use the chat function. I think I've got it working now, so you can message me on there and I'll do my best to get to those either as I go through or at the end. So just kind of mentioned very briefly, I hope you'll kind of come away from this with these three things: why there's a sudden interest in curriculum. I am unashamedly one of those pro-knowledge rich folk, and I'm happy to wear that on my sleeve, and I'll explain why I think that is the best way forward. If you came to the reading one, you'll understand that there's an element of why that is as well through that one, because if we want children to read, and by read I mean to decode and recognize words quickly, but to comprehend, they need vast amount of background knowledge to be able to do these things. And I think a knowledge-rich curriculum gives them that. And then we'll talk about this whole curriculum approach design that I think will be particularly useful for you. So what do I mean by curriculum? I'll show some non-examples first. I say I've made these completely so you can't work out the art, anonymous. So here's what I think we don't mean by curriculum. And from the outset, before a witch hunt begins, I don't mean to shame any school or any particular teacher from this. It's just a range of examples from things that regularly get posted over from support forums on Facebook. And I think it just kind of useful for us to see the disconnect between perhaps what some schools are doing and what's going on with other schools, particularly given the new Ofsted framework, where obviously these teachers in these schools have a particular freedom given to them by their school to arrange the curriculum in this way, and that's absolutely fine. If it's not for me to tell their head teacher how they would want to run their school, but being the deputy head, it's not the way that I would want to run my particular school. Plenty of reasons for that, but again, not there to shame, just to kind of get us thinking about what we mean by this word curriculum. For me, when I talk about curriculum, I think of this continuum between this novice to expert. So at the beginning of schooling, when we are a novice, we know a little thing about something or perhaps nothing. And then by the time that these children leave us, and I'm speaking from a primary perspective here, so the time they leave us in year 6, they know a lot more. And so this is what is often referred to as the intended curriculum. It's the thing that people kind of write down on a document that stipulates what they want the children to learn in each subject. Just because obviously that's the intended curriculum doesn't mean that the enacted curriculum, the what actually happens in the classroom, there's much resemblance to that for a whole wide range of varieties, from World Book Day getting in the way, where it's a down day and things like that, from the WASP coming in at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, meaning that geography and science, that lesson kind of stops for a while. But I think it's important to know that when I kind of talk about curriculum, this is what I mean. It's the kind of this intended curriculum of what we want our kind of students to learn. So why is curriculum now on the agenda? Well, I think there are a few reasons for this. One is the kind of how the 21st century skills curriculum failed to live up to its expectations of what it would deliver us. Naturally, accountability pressures from Ofsted in terms of, or certainly in the past under the old framework, it's how schools were measured on SATs results, for example. So rightly or wrongly, leaders focused on ensuring that there were good SATs results because at the end of the day, their job depended on it. And there's starting to be a bit of evidence, only not much. Very important to say that this whole idea of kind of curriculum coherence is a good bet rather than something that's empirically tested, but it's a bet that I'm willing to make as well. So if we think about 21st century skills, every year or two, the OECD or some large corporation will come out with a survey of the top skills employers need, for this century, for this decade, whatever it may be, and it tends to involve things like this, communication, talking, letters, emails, how to write an email properly, communicating with people, creativity, thinking outside the box, collaborating and working together, and critical thinking and stuff like that. But when you stop and you think about these things for a little while, you realize that these kind of top level skills like communication, creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, they don't really hold up much to this 21st century aspect. Communication, we've been communicating with cave paintings for the best part of 30,000 years now. It's not always been effective. You're very limited with what you can communicate with cave paintings, but we've been communicating for around 30,000 years. When it comes to creativity, we had the Renaissance, which was obviously a massive boon in creativity. Leonardo da Vinci, I would argue he was a very creative person, and certainly nothing 21st century perhaps about him. Collaboration. If collaboration is a 21st century skill, then I pity the person who had to build the Great Wall of China by himself because he couldn't collaborate with anything. Obviously, it literally took a nation to build that wall, and they would have to have communicated, and they would have had shown quite some elements of creativity in that as well. And critical thinking, you've got your classic philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, etc. So I just don't think there's much 21st century skill about these 21st century skills that somehow these are the things that we need to focus children on. If you want children to communicate, to be creative, to collaborate, to think critically, For me, it's just about giving them the knowledge of particular domains with which you want them to do these things. If you know you have a student who really struggles to collaborate in mathematics, then working on his collaboration skills it might have a little bit of an effect, but teaching him the kind of mathematics you want him to collaborate with is far more likely to benefit his collaboration skills than teaching this kind of collaboration skill in some sort of isolation in the hope that it will then transfer over, or it can, supersede the knowledge domain with which they're working within. And so you had, 10, 11 years ago, before the coalition government, you had people like the ATL, the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, who have bringing out leaflets and booklets about towards a curriculum for the 21st century, where the power of synthesis and analysis will be needed, and the ability to interpret, to be critical, and to be able to navigate will be important attributes for the well-educated person in the 21st century. I don't disagree with it, but I just think that they've been attributes that humans have endeavored to be for the last 2,000 years. And so I think trying to jump the hurdle in trying to teach these kinds of things, not in the context of a specific knowledge domain, is not going to be the way to get there. And I think that's an important distinction to make. I think people who kind of make the knowledge rich argument, none of them are talking about ignoring these things. What we're discussing is just the different routes to get to these endpoints. And to say, stick with wear my kind of colours quite on my sleeve and say, I'm firmly that I think the best way to do this is the knowledge rich camp, not necessarily the skills curriculum way. And funnily enough, when we look up the word skill and we look at its etymology, so the history of where the words come from, it comes from the Old Norse, so it would have been used when the Vikings started to come over with the Anglo-Saxons. It means knowledge, and then it got changed to Old English skele, and then it's now skill. So when we talk about a skill, we actually do mean knowledge in here. So obviously we need to. So I think these things sometimes get taught interchangeably. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But I think speaking in terms of knowledge makes things a lot clearer, not just to adults but to students as well. If someone is particularly skillful in something, it can imply that that there's this natural innate talent to it, as opposed to this hours and hours of deliberate practice that have gone on in the background that you don't particularly see. So I like talking things in terms of knowledge anyway. And then it'd be foolish for me to say that these accountability pressures haven't existed, etc., etc. So obviously, this was 2 years ago now, before the pandemic, so it would have been the last lots of SATs results we had, where big headline grabbing titles like a third of students below par in reading, writing, and maths, for example, so not getting that combined measurement. And that pressure is obviously going to be real. And now that there is this seemingly, from the new Ofsted framework, a lack of this kind of accountability pressure from Ofsted in terms of these kind of final outcomes, I think the dynamic is starting to change, but it's early days yet. It only takes one rogue inspector to circulate many a myth around the Twitter sphere. So obviously, Amanda Spielman herself has come out saying, some teachers thought that too much of what trainee teachers currently learn is focused on teaching English and mathematics tests. There's this narrowing of the curriculum as a consequence of too great a focus in preparing for Key Stage 2. So now this is going. Hopefully, our focus is now far more on what are these children learning in those 11 other subjects that we have to teach. Just kind of a small other kind of bit of research study kind of corroborates what we all know has happened anyway. It's that what gets measured gets judged effectively. So if it's not going to get measured, if we're not going to get judged on it, we're not going to try and measure it. So we're going to focus on those things that will have that immediate impact, and we won't worry too much on the humanities. And I've also been there where I've always thought the best way to get students across that hurdle is to plenty of maths, English, reading in the afternoon. So again, no judging, because I've certainly done it, but I'm hoping that this will show you that perhaps there is another way. And then we have obviously this interesting research into curriculum coherence. This particularly comes from the work of Schmidt and Prowat in 2006. So here are the kind of headlines. So it was an analysis of 37 countries that participated in the TIMSS, which is an international assessment looking at maths and science. Obviously, the TIMSS then kind of ranks, similar to how PISA works, it ranks these countries in how they do these particular assessments. And then Schmidt and Prowat, obviously, when they went through, they analysed, they looked at the difference in curricula between those countries. And obviously, they recognised a correlation between the performance of that country and the greater focus and rigour of that curriculum. And they ended up concluding that the content be sequenced in an understandable and logical way. Now, obviously, we're talking about maths and science here. There is a very hierarchical subjects. You need to understand, you need to have the foundation and understand what kind of comes before it for you to be able to move on to the next element. Something like history or geography, there might be some elements of hierarchical knowledge and sequencing, but usually it's quite cumulative. So, it will just build on, build on. So I suggest kind of making a bit of a bet here by saying, well, if this applies to maths and science, I don't really see much of a reason why it wouldn't necessarily apply to history, geography, art, etc. But certainly the evidence base comes from maths and science. So I'm going to be very clear and honest about that. And so they interestingly defined coherence as this homogeneous that's coming together of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And the learning climate as well. So, that culture that you have in your school. Quite interestingly, when Ofsted look at curriculum in any of their research reports, they make sure that it's separated from pedagogy and assessment, etc. So there's two quite competing stances there, which makes the whole thing quite interesting. But the final part that I thought was quite interesting was that they mentioned that a top-down, centrally controlled curriculum is unlikely to bring about coherence. I think if there's anyone who has tried to roll out their own curriculum that they've designed before, I think it's because I personally think it's not going to necessarily work because it's been handed to us. So we're going to have particular biases about who that person is. If it's the government, for example, I know they've brought out a model music curriculum. There's talk very recently about a model history curriculum, which is going to be very interesting. Just because the government have given it to us, it's unlikely to bring about that coherence. I think schools within a limit do have to kind of do this intellectual academic wrestling with what they want to teach within a certain extent. I'm a great believer that a school where I am in London doing the Romans can 90% of the Romans can be the same if they're up in Whitby, for example. They might want to change a few things, but there doesn't really need to be a whole change of exactly what is being taught. So we have this kind of interesting conundrum where we need this coherence if we want to be a high performing school, high performing and get this academic rigor and do. Obviously, we don't just do it for international assessments, but if we want children to do well, we need some sort of coherent curriculum. But someone just giving it to us is unlikely to just bring about that. So let's talk about why I think a knowledge curriculum, and then we'll look at how we can bring these two bits together to kind of think about design that curriculum. So again, if you've listened to the episode of Thinking Deeply about primary education with John Hutchinson, he has an excellent couple of minutes there where he talks about the criticisms of the work that he did at Reach, this idea that when we're teaching knowledge, it's just all about facts, facts, facts. Well, that's not the case at all. When we think about knowledge, we have kind of one way that you can distinct between different types of knowledge is your declarative knowledge. So that is your know that. So yeah, you might know there is, factual stuff is important. You need to know that there are three angles in a triangle. You need to know that there are, the interior angles of that triangle add up to 180 degrees, for example. Then there is your procedural knowledge. That's your know-how. So if I know that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180, and I have two given angles, and one of those angles is missing, then I know how to use that to then help me work out what that missing angle might be. So when we say knowledge rich, we don't just mean facts, we do mean that kind of procedural knowledge of knowing how to do something. It's a very important element of what we believe these kind of curricula to be. As kind of alluded to with the talk on reading, there was some useful evidence that points to background knowledge of the reader being important for comprehension. And so this classic study from Recht and Lisley, famously referenced as the baseball study, took kind of four groups. When they talk about readers over here, what they're talking about is decoders, so word recognition. So a good reader, so they took these students, four groups, obviously did a standardized sort of decoding assessment, split them into groups of good readers or poor readers, good knowledge about baseball, and poor knowledge about baseball. And obviously, they did a bit of comprehension, and they did a little, assessment afterwards. And these results were plotted in a bar graph, as you can kind of see here. So I just want you to kind of make a little prediction yourself as to where each which bar belongs to which particular group from the left-hand side there. So I'll just give you 10 seconds to do that. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is what we got. So high knowledge students, so those that had a good knowledge of baseball and good decoders, naturally did the best, as we would expect. Having a high knowledge and being a poor decoder, you actually performed far better in this particular assessment than if you were an excellent decoder but had low knowledge of baseball. So here we can see that when it comes to reading, this interplay between word recognition and your background knowledge and your language comprehension of this particular subject is important. You need both. Obviously, there'd have to be a point where they would have to be able to read enough to able to access the text, but at some point, their knowledge of baseball would supersede that reading, the actual decoding. So that's quite an interesting study that says, well, maybe there's something about, students having lots of background knowledge about something that's quite important if they want to do good at comprehension. You obviously don't want them just to do well at comprehension, we want them to be good at plenty of things. Then we have this from E.D. Hirsch, Why Knowledge Matters book, which is a really excellent book. In France, I'm sure people are now all familiar with cultural capital. It's a phrase that was popularized in the 80s by the French sociologist Bourdieu, who was part and parcel of some particular curriculum reforms happening in France at the time. The term has now kind of been turned on its head slightly by Ofsted. I can't say I'm a particular fan of how they've used that term. Whatever, we'll deal with that at another point. But if there's one country that loves collecting data more than England, it does seem to be the French. And so in 1987, the final year before Bordeaux's curriculum reforms kicked in, they did some assessments. You can see there at the end of the 5th grade. And then 20 years later, they looked at some more. And you can kind of see here that everyone declined, but the rate of decline was far greater in the children of the unemployed, the children of laborers, the white collar workers, etc., in comparison to the children of executives and intellectuals and the children of professionals. I wouldn't take all this data kind of at face fact. There are people on Twitter who've done a very good job at kind of digging in at the data at a minutiae level and kind of really uncovering how E.D. Hirsch got here. But I think the trend kind of, holds true that when France went from a slightly knowledge-rich to a skills-based curriculum between 1987 and 2007, there was this kind of steep decline in when here it says achievement and fairness, as you can see at the top. So another reason why I think knowledge rich. Again, this piece of research from earlier on this year, the role of background knowledge in reading comprehension, it was there in kind of Recht and Lisley study, the baseball study. It's not just a one-off kind of finding, it's starting to be quite replicable across other studies. So I've just kind of bolded a few important sentences there, so you don't have to read all of that abstract, but just talks about high levels of background knowledge the student has. It has a range of effects that are influenced by the nature of the text, the quality of that situation model required in the presence of readers' misconceptions, but weaker readers are able to compensate somewhat for their relatively weak reading skills in that context of high degree. So over 20 or just about 20 years between Recht and Lisley and this particular study by Smith, Snow, Seri and Hammond, but the conclusion remains. And then, everyone's favorite educationalist, Dylan William, I believe this was written in Creating the Schools Our Children Need. So he's talking about the context of the United States. He lives in Florida now, I believe. But I think if you've been in education or studied education and you looked at how it's changed over the last 20 to 30 years, you can kind of, I think you can include England in this particular context as well, where that mistake that we've made is that if we want children to get them to think, then we need to give them lots of practice, thinking. However, this was an error. What we should be doing is giving them more knowledge, both declarative and procedural, for them to think with. And so then, as I think he encapsulates what I certainly mean by knowledge-rich curriculum beautifully in that last sentence there. The purpose of curriculum is to build up the content of build up content in long-term memory, so that when students are asked to think, they're able to think in more powerful ways. Not necessarily just to win pub quizzes, for example. Hopefully, going on to cure cancer and, climate change and all that thing. Although there was a funny story with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I was writing a scheme of work on a knowledge-rich scheme of work about pirates for year 2. And I think a couple of weeks after I'd finished writing it, I was watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and I kid you not, the last question of the for the £1 million was the date of Blackbeard's death, which those year 2s would have known. So it could have got them £1 million as well, which is no bad thing, but it's not the reason why we do it. Not there in the hope that they go on to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and that right question comes up. So how do we approach curriculum design? Well, I think there are, again, non-examples. Show you 2 ways of how not to do it, and these are from Wiggins and McTighe in their book, kind of Backward by Design, which is an excellent book on curriculum. So you have what's called that activity-focused lesson, which kind of looks like this, where we kind of make sure that students are building Stonehenge out of biscuits, because there's a nice bit of DT and there's a nice bit of history in there somewhere. I'm not sure where, maybe a bit of science. You could compare what is the best base, the bourbon or the custard cream. But if we're honest with ourselves, it's neither history, nor is it DT, but again, no shaming here because I've certainly fallen victim to planning these kinds of activities when I was starting to train as a primary school teacher. Then you have things like the Roman shield. Don't get me wrong, I think every child should probably has the right to go through schooling and make a really cool Roman shield because it is fun. But let's not kid ourselves that using a history lesson to do this is them particularly learning about history. It's not, because they are thinking about what color paint should I use? What should I even make it a Roman based emblem, or should I just design my own kind of thing? So whilst the cognitive processes that they go through while they're doing this aren't necessarily thinking about, okay, well, how many times did Caesar attempt to invade England, etc., etc. And again, for that last one, I think every child does have the right to see, a fake volcanic explosion with bicarb soda and vinegar, but just not at the point where they're actually learning how volcanoes are formed or anything like that. It's a lovely thing to do at the end, and then can you say, well, can you now explain why that volcano erupted in such a way? And they'll be able to use the language of plate tectonics and all of that, and that geographical language we want them to use. But at this step, to start something or to get them to learn that particular thing, it's not such an ideal way to. Oh, in my opinion, it's not such an ideal way for them to be doing it. And then the other way to not do it is this coverage focused lesson. So this is where we might look at the TAF, the teacher assessment framework. We might look at the year 6 or the objectives for our year group, and just make sure that we teach those, not necessarily making sure that our students actually learn those things. So, if here's something that I need to make sure someone's working the expected standard of, because I know I'm going to be judged in writing, I'm just going to make sure that I just kind of plow through this coverage to make sure I can say that I've taught it, in the hope that, they may actually have learned something. What I think we can do is kind of change that language of taught something to hopefully students learning something. So it's a learning focused lessons, and these are sequenced in a way that I think produces valuable learning. And the way I want to kind of teach that to you. Right, so very brief. Then so you had your coverage focused lessons, which is where you would have something like this. You'd go through it, and you would go through and just teach it objective by objective, bit by bit by bit, until you could say, yeah, I've taught them everything they needed to know. But the key word there would be taught. Actually, you haven't ensured that they've actually learnt anything. So the way I think we should go on it is this idea of these learning-focused lessons, where we're making sure the children actually are learning something, but they're sequenced in such a way that actually we produce something valuable by the end of it. In Daniel Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School, he talks about how the human mind is exquisitely tuned to understand and remember stories, that this idea that they're psychologically privileged, and they're treated differently in memory than other types of material, because if you think about the way that we've communicated before writing, we would have had to tell each other lots and lots of stories. So I'm hopefully going to give you curriculum design through two of the greatest stories ever told. One I really think is a great metaphor for curriculum design, one less so, and the two stories are as follows. We have The Simpsons, love The Simpsons, big fan, and you've got Game of Thrones. Again, I'm a big fan. If you haven't seen Game of Thrones, then I suggest you use this half term to kind of start, or you can think about something like Line of Duty or something along that ilk that can help you to make this analogy far more meaningful to you. Now, as I said, I think two of these, I think one of these is really, really good for curriculum design, and one of them is not great as an analogy for designing curriculum. If we think about The Simpsons, you can enjoy any episode without seeing the previous one. So after an awful day at work, we can head back in, we can go get back home, turn on Sky 1, Channel 4, watch an episode of The Simpsons, and knowing that it doesn't matter if I didn't have to watch the previous one at all, I can still enjoy the story very much for what it is. There's no real overarching plots or themes that tie events or episodes together, which kind of helps with that first aspect, that I can enjoy that episode without seeing the previous one. There's very little character development within The Simpsons, particularly after about season 3. That first time that you meet them, there might be a little bit of character development within those first couple of episodes, but for the last 20 odd years, Bart's always been the same, Lisa's always been the same, Homer's been the same, etc., etc. There's been no Damascus moment for them where they've completely changed. And bizarrely enough, episodes are never really referred to again in a meaningful way that's crucial for you to understand the current episode that you might be watching. Nothing wrong with this. I think it is, fantastic switch off TV, but switch off TV it is. And so if you think about what that might look like in the context of curriculum, I think this is a useful model for what that might be. It's just kind of activity after activity after activity, different activity, and you just get this real foundation of shallow knowledge that doesn't really go anywhere. Now, there's nothing wrong necessarily with shallow knowledge. Everyone's knowledge of anything begins at a relatively, shallow level, but as they wrestle intellectually, academically with it, they do more with it, that shallow knowledge, becomes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. But if we think that our lessons are like this, if it doesn't matter that the student missed the previous lesson and they can just learn everything that they need from this lesson, or that there's no, a lesson is never referred to again, it might be likely that this is the kind of curriculum that those children are experiencing, which I don't think is necessarily the best way to do it. Contrast that with something like Game of Thrones, though, and you have overarching plots. You have plots within a series. You have plots within those episodes, and usually the plots within those episodes go some way to help fulfilling that plot within a series, which then goes and helps solve that overarching plot for the whole universe. There's plenty of character development within Game of Thrones. Sansa and Bran from season 1 aren't the same when they get to season 7, season 8. And obviously you're then grappling with large thematic concepts like life and death and good versus evil and things like that you just don't get at all either in The Simpsons. And so I think as a conceptual framework, thinking about curriculum more like Game of Thrones or more like Line of Duty, really does help teachers conceptualize what a good curriculum could be and what it could look like. And so what it can look like, I think, is stipulated in this very simple model here, where you have all of our schooling start. Very important that we start in reception all the way up to year 6. We're starting with an element of shallow knowledge, and over time that shallow knowledge will become deeper knowledge. Now, what's especially important is that when we're thinking about our curriculum design, we are starting here. We're starting with year 6, and we're thinking about what do I want those year 6 students to leave with. Once we understand that, so we know what that looks like, then we can map it all backwards, because that's, if you have an end destination, that is the way that you would find that you would get there. You would find the clearest route there. You wouldn't start to drive in the hope that you'd somehow magically end up at your final destination. And likewise, the writers of all these box sets wouldn't necessarily start writing season 1 or season 2 without having some understanding of what that final outcome, what it looks like at the end, actually is. And so when we're thinking about curriculum design on this kind of larger macro level, so in like a long-term plan, it's very important that we keep this end game, this end result in mind as we are planning everything else. And so if we take away a bit of Game of Thrones and think about what this might look like for history, for example, well, from year reception to year 6, that is my curriculum intent. My intent is everything that I want children to learn in history from year R to year 6. I understand that so there's no such thing necessarily as history in reception, but in some of the early learning goals, there are references to dates in the past, etc., etc. So that's what I mean by that. And then within each season or within each kind of year group, it has those own individual episodes, which are all worthwhile and meaningful in their own rights, and those kind of own subplots, which go some way as they progress through this to kind of really understanding what I want in terms of the school wants for those children to leave knowing with regards to history. And so when we talk about coherence, that is effectively what I mean by that. It's all about making sure that we find that path of least resistance. Because if you think of something like Game of Thrones, Line of Duty, and you try to watch episode 1 first, then episode 3, then 5, then 2, then 4, then 6, then 7, then 8, you are going to be increasingly confused about what is going on. And so that's why I think if you've really thought deeply about your curriculum, why it is so important that it is logically sequenced like a box set. And so when we're thinking about what that might look like on a more granular level, the principles remain. I want to think about what that final outcome is going to be. And then I'm going to work backwards, plotting out how I'm going to get to that specific outcome that's needed. So I'm going to think about how many lessons I need, not necessarily just using, because I'm given a half term, I need to use the whole half term. Just think about for the content that I have, or for my final outcome, how many lessons do I think I'm going to need to achieve this, and then probably add on a couple of more in case of World Salsa Day, and it's all down tools for the afternoon. But as you can see from the text on the right, those principles are the same. So each lesson is going to have its own quote-unquote plot. There's purpose for each one of those being there. So there's something to be solved, or there's new knowledge to be acquired. Each episode is going to then help develop this whole narrative for this particular season or year group in this case, so what this final outcome may be. And it's essential viewing before season 2. So I'm going to make sure that what the work I do in autumn 1 history in year 2 is, they're going to need some of that, not necessarily at their fingertips, but, in the back of their mind, they're going to have to remember some of this, because it's going to make a lot of sense when we come to do whatever history unit or whatever geography unit we're then going to do later on. And it then supports this idea of, building on prior knowledge is one of the best ways that we can ensure children are learning more, by really being really clear. And I know Gareth Rain talks really clearly about this in Kieran Mackel's podcast, Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, where he thinks very deeply about what that schema for those students look like. And if we can think and we have that clear in our heads, then that's going to be really helpful. And I think this also shows one of the reasons why particularly perhaps primary schools find this difficult, because we do work inside. We are a year 3 or a year 4 teacher. Getting that coherence within our year group is certainly easier than having a truly deep understanding of what's happened in year 2, what's happened in year 1. And if you're a year 6 teacher, having that understanding of what that child has learned in year 5, in year 4, in year 3, in year 2, and in year 1, and finding those crucial bits. I'm not saying that this is easy work by any means, but I think it is very much a worthwhile endeavour to try and understand what that information is. And I think that's where you having a very detailed intended curriculum where those links are very clear is something that schools can do to support all of those teachers. And then, of course, if you know all of this, you can then think about the previously. So you can be very specific in what prior knowledge you want to activate before each episode, before each season, because you know exactly what has been taught. And I can guarantee you, if you watch any kind of box set series like this that spans multiple seasons, that the clip that you get, that 30 seconds that you get before the current episode starts, that's not the intern just chosen a random 30 seconds of any kind of work. That is some very careful, thoughtful, deliberate thinking for those 30 seconds to prime the listener as to what's going to happen, to what they know already, and how it's going to relate to what's going to happen next. And so I think certainly it's quite an important thing, quite a useful design tool, I think, for teachers to take as well. And then when we think about more conceptually with curriculum design, Michael Young, who's a social realist, I believe is how he describes himself, talks about there being 3 different type of curriculum. You have your future one, which is your Gradgrindian sort of, knowledge, facts. Only one, the powerful kind of have that control over what gets taught, and that's it. Then he talks about the future 2 curriculum, which was that more skills-based element. And then he came up with this idea of future 3, which is a concept-based, not content or skills, but this idea of a concept-based curriculum. These concepts are really powerful because they can be excellent golden threads that you can weave into the units that you plan, just to add that extra layer of coherence as well, which is always useful, because I think the more coherent the curriculum is, the easier it is for the students to learn it. The issue with primary schools, though, is that there are several ways that we can view these concepts. So every subject has particular concepts that are those subjects. It has what they call them these second order concepts. History, for example, is quite they have their house in order. They are very aware of those kind of core concepts that make up their subject. So talk to any history teacher in secondary school, certainly some in primary, or a historian at the university level. They'll be able to talk about cause and consequence, change and continuity, similarity and difference. Geography, as a subject, they're not too bad, but there's certainly no sense of agreement there as to what those second order concepts are for their particular subject. The ones that I've got there, space and place, scale and connection, proximity and distance, relational thinking, they come from the work of the geographer, Peter Jackson, definitely not the director, the geographer, Peter Jackson. And I know Mark Entz discusses these as well in Powerful Geography. And then you have something like music, again, there, I think a bit more formulated as to what makes up music, this idea of pitch and timbre and texture, volume, duration, and form. And so if you want to kind of keep the subject disciplines intact, I think it is important that teachers, primary school teachers, they have an understanding of what these look like. But there's also this kind of other layer, and I call these kind of the concepts within the subject. So that kind of substantive, they call them substantive concepts. These are things like ruler, king, monarch, monarchy, reign, democracy, migration, persecution from history, for example, or climate, weather, temperature, resources, habitats, prey, immigration. These are concepts that could come up again and again and again and again and repeat throughout any year group and kind of at any point within that specific subject. And so the more of these that we have and that teachers are aware of, the more they can integrate it into their own schemes of learning, the more we can kind of help create and help think about this curriculum and how it all threads together. And these just act like any, to go back to the metaphor for a moment, these just act as those kind of large thematic concepts of good versus evil, for example. An excellent blog as well would be to go and look at Claire Seeley, the 3D curriculum that promotes learning, where she talks about these ideas in a lot more detail. So there is definitely, there is workload implications here. But I think if we want to develop a really good curriculum, it's something that teachers need to be aware of. And so what that might look like in practice, if you know anything about Game of Thrones, particularly that first season, there was lots of air and mystery around this particular dagger. It was a recurring theme that was coming up again and again and again and again in season 1, and then in season 2 it died off. It appears in a few more episodes, but its prominence isn't massive, but it's still there, and you can still make that connection back to season 1. And the same way I think applies for curriculum design. So if I was to think about one particular lesson, I might be looking at similarity and difference. I might be teaching year 2, and I might be teaching them about various different kings and queens across 8 lessons. And so I'm doing similarity and difference. And that's kind of my main second order concept that I'm looking at in history here. So how is carefully chosen my examples of different kings and queens throughout history to show how they've changed, how England changed perhaps over time. And then later on, where I do the Great Fire of London, I might look at change and continuity in that case. So, how did London change? How did it remain the same after the Great Fire? And there'll be some, I will discuss the monarchy. I will discuss the Stuarts at that point, but it's not going to take the vast majority of those lessons. There are other things that are more important, but just by mentioning kings and queens and who was queen at the same time, and what the king did at the time with the Fire of London, that's still going to have that impact of those children being out, oh yeah, and I remember maybe they learned about the Tudors and the Stuarts here, so they're just building up on that schema of what the Tudors and the Stuarts actually are. So that's just kind of a real kind of simple way of how it might actually look between 2 different units. Just because I talk about those particular those concepts doesn't mean that that's the only effective way to approach curriculum design. I wrote this, must be about 3 or 4 years ago, but this came from the idea of Win Harlan and this idea of big ideas. It's a framework that I actually quite like for something like science, because the purpose of science is to kind of understand how the world works. And so I think something like these big ideas actually it can work within science. Doesn't mean it needs to be then you need to use the same framework for the different subjects. You work with what the subject, what the subject's telling you. So my overarching plot in this case would be to learn all of science, all of primary science. Within that, I kind of have my main subplot. So what I did is I looked at the curriculum and kind of organized those into these kind of 5 areas, which were materials, pushes and pulls, the universe, energy, and the natural world. And then from there, I kind of distinguished these particularly big ideas. So if we look at pushes and pulls, one of the big ideas from there is changes in movement or an object require a net force to be acting on it. And then I just kind of tried to find how that might link then to other areas of the curriculum. So you can kind of see how it's cyclical in nature, and there's always something joining it all up. So there's just a kind of another example of another kind of framework that I've developed, which I also think can be particularly useful. So, and you can apply the same principles of the box sets to that, where here's the subplots are simply my seasons, and these are the plots within the lessons that I want to teach them, and every lesson is going to give them a little bit of understanding of how this big idea works in practice, along with examples of what it means to be a scientist, so all that working scientifically element as well, but only in relation to supporting these specific ideas. So some practical examples now. If I'm mapping the concept of empire in history, when I was working at my previous school, this is kind of how it looked like. So they first learn about this concept of empire when Scotland or England are part of an empire during 1666. In year 2, with the pirate topic, we start that off with the expansion of the Portuguese Empire into the New World, which kind of gave rise to piracy. In year 3, we look at the British Empire during the Victorians. In year 4, it's the Roman Empire and the impact on Britain. Year 5, it's the rise of the Egyptian Empire. And in year 6, they do a crime and punishment. So we look at, again, that the first empire, the Tudors and Stuarts, which links kind of back to what we were doing with year 1 as well. So again, each time a different example, each one a different country. Each time that the children meet this idea of empire, they're either adding a new example of what this concept empire means, but it's also creating more pathways to remember what they've done previously. Trade in history looks like this. So in year 1, we very briefly look at the history of shopping and just how it goes back to a simple trade bartering system to a monetary system. In that same topic of the Portuguese Empire, we look at pirates in the New World and the disruption of key Atlantic trade routes that the pirates caused, the economic benefit of the economic results of that. In year 3, with the Iron Age, we look at the Beaker people and how that really kind of started this idea of trading. We look at then the impact the Roman Empire had on Britain, its increase of trade, because Britain becoming part of the Roman Empire opened up a lot more of the empire up for trading. With that year, with the Egyptians, there's a specific lesson looking at Hatshepsut's trade mission to Punt, which really kind of helped generate a lot of wealth for Egypt during that time. And in year 6, when we look at Tudors and their histories, as well as we frame it in a few other units as well, we do one on the Antarctic, but we look at that kind of the northwest passage to really kind of increase trade as well between Asia and Europe as well. So that's just another example of how trade gets out there. Now, if we're primary school teachers, we know that we love a good bit of cross-curricular, and I have no issue with cross-curricular whatsoever, providing that the subject discipline remains. And so I think to probably stretch the box set analogy as far as it probably can go, so I like to think of cross-curricular link as some sort of spin-off, in the same way that the plots are completely different. So there's that represents the different subject, but you are fully aware that you are in the same universe. So there's that essence and that feel of familiarity to everything. So, and things that you encounter within the spin-off may refer back to that original series, or indeed things that you see in the spin-off may then show the way for be involved in a later on series down the line of the original. So I think it's quite a fun little way to kind of stretch that analogy, and I think quite a useful one to think about. Right, is this cross-curricular link that I'm trying to make, is it suitable, or am I just kind of taking things a little bit too far? And so that might be something like this. So we're mapping the concept here of empire in RE. Now you notice in year 1, year 2, and year 3, there's nothing there, and that's fine. There was no meaningful link to be made, so it's fine. I'm not going to rush to make it. I appreciate talking about RE right now is a bit of a hot topic, so please do not screenshot this particular one. I don't want to worry about original sin anytime soon. But in year 4, when we look at RE, we're going to look at the Roman Empire and the rise to Christendom within that as well. In year 5, when we study Islam, we're going to look at Islam and the Caliphate, and this idea of them wanting, a big part of Islam is this idea of, this Caliphate, this Islamic rule, this Islamic empire. And then in year 6, when we look at World War II, of course we do, but when we look at Judaism as well, we look at those beliefs and how Nazis, particularly disagreed with particular beliefs, etc. This idea of Third Reich, it means Third Empire in German, so we can kind of tie in those cohesive ties as well, where some may think that it is, too strenuous, but I think it works quite well. And so when we're thinking about our schema for our particular child, just of the empire, this is kind of what it looks like, with all of those links in between everything for that subject. Well, in history is represented by the green, and the blue represents then the RE, and you can see all of those links that happen between them. And so that's how you get to, I think, then this idea, what curriculum means to me, to bring it back to the beginning of what is curriculum. It's how do we take young Anakin, Skywalker here, and how do we make him far more expert at the end? And it all comes back to that intended curriculum through these kind of principles that I've discussed through this. So I just want to show a few examples now of what this intended curriculum actually looks like. Again, these are from previous school that I worked in. So here's that year 2 lesson, or that year 2 scheme on piracy and the expansion of the New World. So you can see here I've highlighted the part where it says they mention rival empires, etc., etc. Key vocabulary then all organized in bolded up. And again, these are available to all the teachers that were available to all the teachers at the school. So the year 6 teacher could see what they were expected to know, in year 2. Obviously, COVID's put a stop to this, kind of being the nice coherent map that I was hoping it would be. But I look forward to hopefully hearing in a couple of years' time that children getting a whole 6 years of this will pay dividends. A year 3 lesson. Looking at obviously ancient Rome. So this idea of Julius Caesar becoming a dictator for life. This concept of dictator is going to come up again and again, especially when they get to hopefully when they get to year 6, learn about Adolf Hitler, Emperor, Roman Empire. Here we have year 3 or year 4 when we're looking about looking at Greece. So we're looking at city-states here. This idea that city-states were pretty independent, but they'd come together if there was an external attack. In the case of Greece, that was usually the Persian Empire. Within the same unit, then, we look at Alexander the Great. Again, links back to the Persian Empire as well, so specific empires are all in there. What's interesting as well, if you look over here, this is the prior knowledge. This is what I think is the key prior knowledge. So this idea that, before this unit, they've already done Alfred the Great. And so we can think about then, well, if Alfred the Great was the only king to be given the name Great, how then can we compare Alexander the Great? Is he just as worthy of this name Great as Alfred was? In regards to Egypt, then, so we have this kind of giving this overview of this Egyptian empire and what it means. I say over here is the prior knowledge thing, so we can be very specific about what our students should have already learned. So over here, we know in year 4 they would have done climates, in year 2 they would have done deserts. So this idea of Egypt being like a desert is new to them. It won't be new to them. They've already looked at rivers in a bit of detail, so they know what a river is, they know what a delta is, they know what a floodplain is, they know what those common misconceptions are. We know what other civilizations that they've studied. We know we've been very specific about where that these early settlements of all these great civilizations did start off near water, a source of water, because water was needed for agriculture. It's needed for living, etc., etc. So we can build all of this prior knowledge into students' learning to make sure that these lessons, as they progress through the curriculum, become deeper and richer. Again, we also use a few units, to go back and study previously studied eras, but we would use, we'd kind of have a different theme for that particular one. So for example, at the end of year 4, students will study health and medicine, and they'll start that off by going back to what health and medicine looked like during the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Age. Because they've already studied the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Age, they'll look at it through what health looked like during Greek times, because they've already studied the Greeks. They'll look at it when they've studied them, and they'll look at health in the Romans, because they've already studied the Romans. So we can be really clear that during those lessons, or during those units of Greece and Rome and the Romans, the teacher who teaches those ones aren't to worry about, or don't bring up medicine as such, or don't go into it in so much detail, because they don't need to, because that's going to come later on, and that just kind of gives a nice opportunity for us to kind of revisit then all this prior learning that we want. So the one that you're seeing here is an example of, I think, a year 6, and we look at the history of espionage. So we go back to different periods of time that were studied, and we look at this particular idea of what espionage and spying look like. And it's quite a fascinating unit, actually. And then to kind of cap it all off, then is so you can kind of see how it comes full circle. In this particular lesson in when we're studying World War II, we have this idea that Hitler passed the Nuremberg laws. So he becomes this dictator for life again. So it links back to the year 3 and what they did at the in that very first unit of history in year 3, where Caesar became a dictator of this Third Reich, this Third Empire, links it all back then and makes it hopefully all cohesive. If you have seen Game of Thrones, the last season wasn't particularly very good. So kind of a word of warning, just make sure that everything is worthwhile that you put in there. I like to think of this part as that bit after you've done, if you have taught year 6, after you've done the SATs, like the kids kind of give up at that point, and then you have to go through that kind of unstructured time between preparing them for whatever performance it may be and the end of term, and it can be a bit of a bit all over the place, or certainly was in my experience anyway. So just make sure that that part is particularly good, and don't, you know, it's as useful as it can be. I understand that that could be a bit of a lot to take in there. So a great place to start is Christopher Such. If you just Google Christopher one-stop shop for Christopher Suchmo 83, Christopher has put together starting points, I think would be a fair way to describe them, for science, geography, and history, where a lot of the core knowledge is already done for you. A lot of the thinking about the those big thematic concepts are done for you. And so if you're thinking, oh, I really like the sound of this, but I really don't know where to start, definitely go here, because it really is a treasure trove of curriculum thinking. Not many people seem to know about this one, but it really is another gold mine as well. If you go to the Core Knowledge Foundation, just make sure it's the American one. They have lots and lots of teacher, but also student guides for not everything on the national curriculum, because it is an American site. But as you can kind of see here, this would be per this. They have a teacher guide. All these teacher guides are about 150 odd pages of just subject knowledge for teachers. It has tier 2 vocabulary in there, and it also has just really nice sections of reading that you could use for your students as well. So here you can see in this particular one, there's 43 pages, if not more, of text that you could get your students to actually, that the teacher may choose to read to the students, or even better, the students may actually read themselves. And so that might be quite a good starting point as well. And I would also recommend you follow these particular people. So you have Christopher Such, who's at Suchmo 83, Christine Council, who's at Council_C, Andrew Percival, who is definitely a trailblazer in terms of thinking like this, in terms of primary curriculum. Primary Pete as well. He's also another fantastic who takes this approach. I'm sure he'll be willing to answer questions. Mr. S. Tiffany focuses on history at the primary level, but he talks about those concepts a lot. So if you're thinking about, oh, how can I support my history? I'm not really sure about what those second order historical concepts are. Stuart Tiffany will be able to help you there. Claire Seeley is kind of the primary curriculum guru, without a shadow of a doubt. She's edited a book about curriculum, and she's currently head of curriculum and standards at Guernsey. So right now the state of Guernsey, but I'm not sure what we'd call it. But Guernsey is going through this kind of curriculum transformation in line of this way of thinking. Mrs. S teaches, that's Victoria Morris. She's another excellent curriculum thinker at primary. She's recently become a deputy head, so her school is going through this particular process of change right now. You have Lloyd Williams-Jones, who's at L. Williams-Jones. I've been fortunate enough to go into his school and work with him, and we kind of to work on his history curriculum. And so he's at the point now where he's at that implementation phase. So if you're a leader and you're thinking about what this looks like, how I implement all this change, he's definitely someone to talk to. You've got Tom Brassington, who's Brasso Teach. He leads geography at his particular school. And again, he's doing some really, really interesting things with leading geography. So if you're thinking about how I can support my subject leaders on this, if you're a geography subject lead, I would definitely point them towards that one. And then you have Simon Keynes as well, who is particularly good at using booklets to help his to make sure his intended curriculum is as enacted as possible. So he uses the booklet approach, which is seemingly quite popular as well. It would be remiss of me to not to remind you, this is something that you do want to do, is that the government are planning on introducing a model history curriculum. So we don't know yet when it's going to be announced, but definitely think carefully about how much work you want to put into that, because I think it's going to come out sooner rather than later. And the final thing, if you can still see me and hear me, is that it'd be remiss of me not to kind of promote the Research Ed Guide to Curriculum, where a lot of the ideas that I've kind of mentioned, along with the work of others, particularly who I've just mentioned as well, they've written short chapters on what this might look like and how this can work in your schools. You can follow me at Mr. Armand Ed, and I'm very happy to help and support schools how I can. And I also blog at Nuts About Teaching, .wordpress.com. I haven't blogged for a while, but I'm hoping I have a bit more time now. Things are settling down. I'll be able to blog a bit more coming up before the end of the year. And thank you very much for joining me yet again, or for the first time. I hope, say, if there's anything that you've taken away from it, then I'm particularly happy. Thank you very much, and hopefully if there are any questions, I'll be on Twitter for a little while longer. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Hope you found these 2 sessions particularly useful.